I'm going to turn this over to Bradley Peterson. He is the Executive Director of the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, and he will kick things off for us.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today on this chilly January day. We really do appreciate your time. We know that you guys are very busy. There's lots of news going on, but it's really critical that we connect with you, the service that you provide in your communities in terms of covering issues critical to Greater Minnesota and weighing in editorially. It really is important to the communities that you serve, and we really do appreciate it. Before we get into our formal program here, I do want to respond to some breaking news. I know the governor just came out with his tax bill proposal. We understand that there is a $20 million increase in the base appropriation for local government aid. This mirrors what was in the tax bill at the end of session. We really appreciate the governor's recognition and ongoing commitment to the local government aid program. Of course, the CGMC goal remains a $45.5 million increase to get us back to the 2002 level, and we're counting on the legislature to get us there. There's a long ways to go here in the legislative process and a lot more discussion on that to happen. And we can touch on that more if you would like at the very end when we have time for questions. But next I'd like to introduce our speakers for this morning. In addition to myself, we have Mayor Sarah Carlson, the Mayor of Alexandria and current President of the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities. We have Dave Smigluski, the Mayor of Granite Falls and our first Vice President, and also Blaine Hill, the Morris City Manager. We also have with us today for some commentary Marty Seifert, who's a lobbyist with the Coalition, author, former candidate for governor, and a former minority leader. And again, please hold questions until the very end. As we launch into the 2017 session, I think it would be remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time reflecting on the 2016 election and the message that voters sent to lawmakers in St. Paul. Time and time again, whether it was in Greater Minnesota or rural parts of other parts of the country, you had this sense, this feeling, this discussion, this frustration that rural residents were being left behind, that their needs are not being addressed, that it's not getting done for them, that they're being left out of the greater narrative and the greater conversation. Residents in Greater Minnesota want strong communities and opportunities for their families and businesses, and frankly, they're sick of having these needs swept under the rug, and they want to be part of the narrative. And so as we launch into session, and before we get into our specific legislative agenda, we wanted to frame that as what we think drives the message that voters were sending to St. Paul. And to expand on that, I'd actually like to turn it over to Sarah Carlson for just a moment to talk about some of the things she's hearing in conversations in her community.
Thanks, Bradley. Yeah, I was recently out at our Runestone Community Center for our energy savings event, talking to people about bonding for a third sheet of ice, and most of our residents really felt a sense of energy and optimism that they won't be forgotten or left behind anymore. Rural voters had felt very left out, very left behind, and they really want their legislators to carry the message that Greater Minnesota is important. They want to be part of the narrative, and with the recent election, they're really feeling that they're going to be part of that narrative. And their expectation is that their legislators are going to come to St. Paul and get it done.
And I'd like Marty Seifert also to comment on this. He, of course, lives in Marshall and talks to a lot of people around the state. Marty?
Yeah, thanks, Bradley. First of all, thank you all for being on the phone. We're not going to be able to tell our story without good people like you helping tell it with us. I'm a soft-spoken man of few words, so I'll be as brief as I can here. In talking to people about election results, I think it was really a lot of rejection of business as usual. And business as usual defined recently in the last session or two, I think, would be lack of completion on major legislation all the way through the process, without assigning any blame to any particular party, person, entity, caucus, or political realm. we've had our top priorities really focused this morning on the three major things that did not get done in the last year or two. A tax bill that includes high priorities for rural Minnesota, including LGA. Bonding bill that includes high priorities like wastewater infrastructure funding, and a transportation bill that includes corridors of commerce and city street funding. So not surprisingly, our organization wants to pick up from where things left off. We believe that our narrative fits in perfectly with what the frustrations were with voters in rural Minnesota, and we would like to see the legislature move swiftly and quickly on these items. We believe that there's bipartisan support for those, and we just don't want to see high priorities move to the back burner. The frying pans are piled up on the back of the legislative stove in terms of moving everything to the back burner the last year or two, and we want to see things cooking, and we want to see it done now. So I'll turn it back to Bradley and stand for questions later.
So as we launch into the specifics of our agenda, we really feel that the things that we are focused on are those types of bread and butter items that simply need to get done this legislative session. We've had 2 years without a tax bill. We've had no progress on transportation. We missed an opportunity to do a bonding bill last year, and it is time to get things done. And we really feel that if these things are addressed, it'll go a long way to addressing that sense in greater Minnesota of being left out and left behind. And so the first item on our agenda is a $45.5 million increase in local government aid. If you follow the CGMC at all, you have heard this before. That obviously gets us back to the 2002 level of funding, which is frankly not enough, but it is the next step in restoring this important program. And we've talked a lot about the property tax impacts of local government aid, but I think what sometimes gets lost in translation and what has been brought to the fore by the recent election is really the quality of life elements. 2 years ago or 3 years ago rather, when money went into the local government aid formula, communities did all sorts of things, good things with it. Not only did they catch up on some of the deferred maintenance on streets and parks and trails, but they also invested in student resources officers in schools, they invested in libraries, they invested in their clean water infrastructure, all of these things that we all know are critical to building strong, healthy, vibrant communities where people want to live and do business. And that's really what LGA provides for our communities. On transportation, we're looking at $369 million for corridors of commerce and $50 million for city streets. The $50 million split evenly, $25 million between cities under 5,000 and cities over 5,000. That, of course, is the demarcation line for whether or not you get state aid for your streets. Cities over 5,000 do, cities under 5,000 do not. And then finally, a robust bonding bill that includes $167 million for clean water infrastructure. Of course, this was part of the governor's proposal last year that we strongly supported. He reiterated his support for that in his bonding bill yesterday. And as you will hear from Blaine and Morris, it is a critical need in communities across greater Minnesota. And so now to dig in on what these items mean more specifically for communities around the state, I'm going to start with Sarah Carlson from Alexandria again to talk a little bit about local government aid, both from her perspective in Alexandria and for the other communities in her region.
Thank you, Bradley. Well, like you said, LGA means many different things to greater Minnesota cities. It means being able to afford the basic services our residents expect, like police and fire protection, sidewalks, and well-maintained streets. In Alexandria, it means being able to purchase that police squad car that we've put off for many years. It will also mean being able to fund and fix more roads in our area. But Alexandria being a regional center, it's critical to many small cities that surround Alexandria for their budgets. They depend very heavily on local government aid to be able to fund their cities, and it needs to go back to the 2002 numbers and the $45.5 million number to be able to support greater Minnesota cities.
Mayor Smigluski, did you want to add anything on the local government aid issue?
Well, yeah, sure, Bradley, thanks. LGA is critically important in helping cities all over Minnesota, including in the metro area, in keeping property taxes reasonable and providing essential services. We just can't stress enough how important that funding source is for cities of all sizes and all shapes and all locations across Minnesota.
Blaine?
Yeah, what we do is we use LGA to do, I think, one of the things that it's supposed to be doing, and that is keeping taxes down. I know the history of the tax levy in Morris actually mirrors the history of the tax levy that I had when I was in Breckenridge back in the early 90s when LGA increased. Taxes went down in both those communities, and they've been held down with increases in LGA, and it's important that that be funded moving forward.
All right, and now to discuss a little bit our transportation priorities, Dave Smigluski, Mayor of Granite Falls.
Thanks, Bradley. Transportation has been an issue that somehow continues to get skirted over the past several sessions of the legislature, and there's a number of reasons for that. But we feel like they really have to address this issue, transportation funding. The governor has come out with an idea on a comprehensive transportation funding package. We support that very strongly, but we also know realistically that that may or may not happen. So at the very least, we're asking the legislature and the governor to support funding for Corridors of Commerce program to the tune of $369 million, and also $50 million for city streets. The city streets situation is, for example, the town that I'm the mayor of, Granite Falls, is under 5,000. We don't get any gas tax money, any money that comes out of the payment of collection of taxes for the sale of gasoline. We fund our local streets entirely local. A few years ago, the legislature did fund, made a one-time funding source of $12.5 million that got scattered around for cities under 5,000. We're asking for $25 million, as essentially double that, and then another $25 million for cities over 5,000, because of course those cities have huge needs as well. It's an important part of maintaining the streets that serve Minnesotans all over the state, of course. And also, it's also an important source of, or an important way of keeping property taxes down, because we fund those streets through taxes and through assessments that go directly toward local property owners. In the Corridors of Commerce program, a few years ago, the state legislature funded and the governor signed off on a $300 million bill. Most of those projects across Minnesota have been finalized or wrapped up now. Included projects on Highway 14 and Highway 23, Highway 610 here in the metro. Some significant, long sought-after projects, bottlenecks, and big safety improvements. We see an opportunity to do that again. Absent any sort of comprehensive funding, a one-time shot of money aimed at some of those projects, again, is at the very least something that we feel is very doable, particularly in light of the surplus that the state has, and something that we really need to get on with. So at the very least, we should get that done. There's an opportunity to do quite a bit of work and get some of these big projects off the table again. So we really encourage the legislature to act on that and go forward with that at the very least for transportation funding.
And finally, before we take some questions, I'd like to turn it over to Blaine Hill to talk about the water and wastewater infrastructure funding. The City of Morris has a particularly compelling story, and Blaine is here to talk about it. Blaine?
So we know that the governor is very interested in clean water and doing things to try to improve the water quality in Minnesota. And one of the issues that we have in Morris is that we do have a chloride problem with our wastewater treatment plant going into the Pomni-Terre River system that's in Morris. And we know the problem with that chloride comes from salt that's used in water softeners in every home, business, and institution in Morris. Morris actually has some of the hardest water in the state of Minnesota, and the chloride standard that we were issued, we were about 3 times over that standard. So what we did was we got together with the MPCA and tried to figure out what a solution was, and determined that we couldn't fix it at the wastewater treatment plant. It just wasn't going to work. It's very cost prohibitive to try to take salt out at that end of the system. So what we figured out was we have to do it at the water treatment plant before it actually goes to everyone. But we have a water treatment plant that's working, and people are paying for it through their rates. So then we got together with the governor and MPCA to try to figure out a solution, and really the solution is to invest in infrastructure for smaller communities that have these issues that can't afford to do it themselves. We bid out a project to do a water treatment plant. It was $18 million. In order to get assistance from the state, there had to be money put into the bonding bill. That's where the $167 million comes in. There's also language that was written and agreed upon by everyone, actually. It just wasn't signed by the governor, to increase the caps in the wastewater end of the system and the water treatment plant end of the system. And based upon those new caps, the city of Morris would be eligible for about $12 million to pay for an $18 million plant that we need to fix a water problem, but we don't need to fix right now because it wasn't scheduled to be fixed. So that is the solution, and we're hoping that this year the bonding bill gets done. It wasn't done last year. We do have a new bid opening on the plant because the old bid couldn't be held over as long as we needed it to be. So we plan on opening a new bid in February. We're assuming it might be a little bit higher because we're a year down the road farther here. If we don't get help, our rates double. If we do get help, then we'll be able to afford to find the solution to cleaning up the river.
Thanks, Blaine. And I just want to reiterate, we're talking about a city of just over 5,000 people facing a cost of $18 million. And their situation is not uncommon. There are scores of cities across the state of Minnesota that are facing similar costs necessitated by aging plants, regulations, cleaning the water. And so when it comes to a bonding bill, it really cannot wait. And so before we take questions, I just want to offer one final thought. Again, we believe that the election sent a strong message to leaders in St. Paul that it's time for Greater Minnesota to be heard and for their needs to be met. And I think, as Mayor Carlson said, there is an expectation and there is an energy in Greater Minnesota right now as this legislative session begins that they will be heard and that their needs will be addressed. And so throughout the legislative session, we're going to be pounding on doors, talking to legislators, engaging with our communities every day from now until the third week in May to make sure that these things get done. And if there is no tax bill, if there is no bonding bill, if we can't make any progress whatsoever on transportation, that would represent a significant failure on the part of lawmakers and the governor. It's time to get things done. So with that, really appreciate your being on the call, and we'd be happy to open up to questions.
For the water and sewer projects, could you give examples of the cost to cities if the state doesn't step in?
Well, for Morris, go ahead, Blaine.
Well, for Morris, the water one's pretty easy. It's $18 million. And when you break that down, one of the things that I'd like to share is that in Morris, we pay for infrastructure in the streets through special assessments and not through rates. So in a number of cities, they actually pay for it through the water rates. But we're looking at doubling our water rates on top of people still having to pay for instance, we have a $2.5 million project coming up next year to redo water and sewer and streets. And the special assessments for the average home in that project are going to be about $15,000 each. And then they'd get slammed for double the cost for their water on a water treatment plant. So you're looking at probably $25 to $30 a month just to pay for a plant. Like I said, it's already working.
The cost difference on the short answer is under current legislation, Morris will get $3 million max. Under the bonding bill with the language of the appropriations, $12.5 million.
And just
for a town of 5,200.
And just to give you a sense, I'm looking at the Public Facilities Authority is the one who collects all of this data, and they've actually got some good information out, and they have what's called the Intended Use Plan carryover projects from 2016, so things that didn't get done. If you just look at the first couple of names on that list, you've got Western Lake Superior Sanitary District, which is just south of Duluth. They've got a $4.9 million project. Minneota, a very small town in western Minnesota, $1.4 million. Central Iron Range Sanitary District, $5 million. Pipestone, $1 million. Jackson, $2.2 million. Wilmer, $1 million. Afton, $7.1 million. St. James, $2.9 million. And it's a very, very long list of similar cities and similar numbers. Other questions?
Yes, Kennedy here with the Bemidji Pioneer. I was just wondering if you could talk about some of the other things that you might be prioritizing this legislative season related to sort of business and economics. I understand that the main focus is going to be on the big three, transportation and bonding and taxes, but I was wondering if there are any other legislation related to improving the economy in around the Bemidji region and also the Iron Range?
Sure. We've got a number of things that we're working on, particularly in partnership with our sister organization, the Greater Minnesota Partnership, which is a group of EDAs, local chambers of commerce, nonprofits, higher education, and individual businesses. One of the items that they and CGMC will be focusing on is workforce housing. We had a workforce housing tax credit that was introduced during the last biennium. It was put in the Senate tax bill. It did not make it into the final conference committee bill, but it's really aimed at addressing what is really a critical need in many communities in Greater Minnesota, is a shortage of affordable housing for people who are earning a living and people who have some level of income and don't qualify for low-income focused programs. So that is one. Another item that we are working on is the Greater Minnesota Business Development Public Infrastructure Grant Program. This program helps pay for the public infrastructure of business expansions. A lot of communities across the state have used it to build out business parks, industrial parks. It has really been what has helped jumpstart many of these projects across Greater Minnesota. The governor put $21 million into his bonding bill yesterday, which is an awesome number. No governor has ever recommended more money for that than that. We're very supportive of that. We also have some bills around job training. There's an internship program that needs a little fixes for Greater Minnesota that we've got some legislation on. So we've got a full slate of all sorts of things that we're working on. But workforce housing, Greater Minnesota business development infrastructure, and the job training piece and BDPI, I would say, are the main ones.
Thank you.
This is Al from the Echo Press.
Hi, Al.
Sarah, maybe you want to... Hey, hi, Sarah. Maybe you want to take this. What do you see as the main stumbling block for not getting an increase in LGA?
Well, you know, we don't, and Bradley will chime in too, we don't have any illusions that it's going to be easy to get a lot of things passed during this session, but, you know, we have a DFL governor and a Republican House and Senate, so there's going to be, that will be tough to get some things passed, but we also have bipartisan support for LGA in both House and Senate. So we think that is really, we really think that with that support in the House and Senate, that sends a strong message to the governor that that's really an important thing that needs to get done.
I would add to that, I think the short answer on the stumbling block of whether or not we get it done is going to depend on what sort of willpower is shown by legislators, especially rural legislators. This is a doable thing. If you look at both the House and the Senate, the majority of the majority caucuses are made up of rural legislators, all of whom acknowledge the importance of this program for their communities. And so it really is a matter of on them. If they want to do it, and if they want to power it through, and if they want to jawbone and coerce their colleagues, they can do it.
Okay. Do you think you'll run into that same problem again, though, like last session, where the rural groups kind of collided with the metro and wanted to eliminate the LGA for, you know, the Iron or Duluth and Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Well, here's what I'll say about that, and you're right to point that out as a concern. And for just a refresher on the history, 2 years ago in the tax bill, the House went after drastic cuts in local government aid for Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Duluth. Half of Minneapolis' LGA, half of St. Paul's LGA, and 2/3 of Duluth's LGA. We fought back very strongly against that because we felt that it undermined the program. At the end of the 2016 session, they passed a $20 million increase to local government aid without any formula changes. That is an acknowledgement to us by the legislature that they've moved past that. And so if they go back to that policy of trying to dredge up these old arguments, these old discussions, then all they are doing is taking the discussion backwards and harming Greater Minnesota. We expect that they can move forward positively with an increase on a good formula that we have now. We'll go out and make the case, but again, it's going to come down to whether or not these rural legislators have the willpower to do it.
Okay, that's good. One more quick question I was going to ask. It's a rumor question, and I don't know what you guys can say about it, but I've been told by a couple of different people that a study or something is going to be coming out soon about LGA that is not going to paint a very good picture of LGA. It's going to be, you know, that it's not all it's cracked up to be, that there's some problems with it. Have you heard anything? Is there anything pending on that, or?
We've not heard anything.
Just a rumor.
Okay. That's good to know, too.
Other questions?
I wanted to ask, I'm sorry, this is Maureen with Forum News Service. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the workforce housing tax credit and what you'd like that to look like this year.
Sure. So what it does basically is it allows for an opportunity for local investors and local businesses to invest in projects in their own community. And so what we're trying to find is sort of a market-oriented solution to this crimp on the housing market. Right now, housing markets in many of our communities are simply not working because banks won't invest in what they see as perhaps not great circumstances where that company goes down. And so this is an opportunity actually for local investors to take matters into their own hands and invest in projects in their communities to provide for their own needs. And so that's kind of the basic premise of it. And you know, we're hopeful that we can rally support behind this. There have been a lot of ideas thrown on the table in terms of how do you address this problem. Some people have come up with ideas around there's been a grant program that has been minimally funded that DEED has been implementing. The League of Cities came up with a tax increment financing program that would use tax increment financing to help finance some of these projects. We put our thinking caps on, looked around to see if there were any programs in other states that might work, and our tax credit is actually modeled on something that came out of one of the Dakotas. Like I said, got some traction last biennium in the Senate, and we're hopeful that we can push it forward in both bodies this year. Other questions?
Yes, this is Kevin Sweeney with the Journal in New Ulm. I just had a question. You mentioned the results of the election, and your interpretation of that is that rural Minnesota, greater Minnesota, is going to be more involved. With Republicans taking control of the legislature, doesn't that mean that their philosophy of let's not spend so much money, let's not tax so much, let's hold bonding to less than $1 billion if we can possibly do it, is going to be strengthened?
Well, I still think that, and I'll let Marty respond to this as well. But you know, my quick take on it is the things that we're talking about are really bread and butter issues: infrastructure, property tax relief, streets, the types of things that there's broad acknowledgement that government should be doing. You know, was it 2 years ago when Representative Torkelson came out with his bonding bill, he said it was lots of cake, not a lot of cream. And the thing that we're talking about are cake. And we think that the agenda that we've put together is something that legislators of both stripes can rally around. But I'd like Marty's perspective on that too.
Yeah, hi Kevin. I think, you know, if you take a look at $1 billion bonding bill, they can fully fund the water infrastructure and BDPI programs that we're for and still have $1 billion bill. You got to start with the basics and then move up from there. The transportation pieces that Dave Smigluski talked about, corridors of commerce and city streets, we haven't had one Republican from the most conservative member of caucus to the most moderate tell us that those are bad ideas or that we shouldn't do them. Local government aid, I think by and large with the rural legislators has been, for the most part, supported on a bipartisan basis. It's just really the amount and how it's distributed has been more of a discussion item. But all the things we're talking about today are totally achievable regardless of who's in charge of the House and Senate. And we've dealt, our firm has dealt with this circumstance of our priorities under Republican governor, Democrat legislature, split legislature, an independent governor with one house of each body. I mean, we are very adept at maneuvering through the political circumstances, and I think it's really a nonpartisan, bipartisan policy solution. All the things that we have on our agenda are totally doable regardless of which party's in control.
Okay, thank you.
All right, maybe one more question? All right, well, we are always available. I think you know how to get a hold of Julie if you want more insight on our perspective on things as session progresses. We really appreciate your being on the call. We will be sending a press release to you directly that outlines some of the highlights of our agenda and our perspective. But again, we really appreciate you taking the time and the critical role that you play in communicating these issues throughout the state. Have a great day, everybody.